Alex and Sarah Jensen vanished from their yacht, the Serenity, off the coast of Martinique in May of 2018. For 1 full year, their case was a complete and baffling mystery, a ghost story whispered among sailors in the Caribbean. The couple, their dreams and their 42-foot vessel seemed to have been swallowed whole by the placid turquoise water, leaving behind nothing but a profound and aching silence. The official search found their boat, adrift and empty, a silent testament to a journey cut short, but it offered no answers. The investigation went cold, the file gathering dust on a shelf, another unsolved maritime tragedy. For 12 long months, their families were trapped in a state of suspended grief, unable to mourn, unable to hope. The ocean keeps its secrets well. But then, a year to the day after they were last heard from, a battered life raft washed up on a remote beach hundreds of miles away. What a group of teenagers found inside it would not only solve the mystery of the vanishing, but would also expose a chilling truth, a deliberate act of cruelty so profound, it would shock investigators and rewrite the very narrative of what happened on the open water. The discovery would change everything. Alex Jensen was a man built of quiet confidence and meticulous plans. At 34, he was a rising star at a prestigious architecture firm in Chicago, known for his innovative designs that blended sustainability with stark modern beauty. He saw the world in lines, angles, and possibilities. His mind was a blueprint of dreams, the most prominent of which was escaping the concrete grid for the boundless freedom of the open ocean. Alex wasn't an escape artist in the traditional sense. He wasn't running from anything. He was running to something. He was a man deeply in love with his wife, Sarah, and with the life they were building. They had met in college, a classic case of opposites attracting. Where Alex was reserved and analytical, Sarah was effervescent and empathetic. She was a pediatric oncology nurse, a profession that required a reservoir of compassion that seemed bottomless. She spent her days in a world of muted colors and hushed hallways, fighting for the smallest victories, celebrating an extra day, an easier breath. Her work gave her a profound appreciation for life, for the preciousness of time, a perspective that balanced Alex's forward-looking ambition. Their apartment was a reflection of their shared life. His minimalist furniture and architectural sketches shared space with her overflowing bookshelves and vibrant, chaotic paintings. They complemented each other perfectly. Alex grounded Sarah, giving her a safe harbor from the emotional storms of her job. Sarah, in turn, taught Alex to see the beauty in imperfection, to value the moment he was in, rather than just the one he was planning for. Their dream of sailing wasn't a whim. It was a 10-year plan. It began the night Alex proposed on a rented sailboat on Lake Michigan, the city lights twinkling behind them. He had laid out a timeline, a budget, a 5-point plan for achieving their goal. Sarah had just laughed, kissed him, and said yes. For the next decade, that plan was their scripture. They took sailing classes on weekends, starting with tiny dinghies and working their way up. They spent vacations getting certifications, learning celestial navigation and marine diesel repair. Every bonus, every tax refund went into the boat fund. They lived frugally, driving old cars and packing their lunches, their eyes fixed on the horizon. Their friends sometimes joked about their single-minded focus, but they didn't understand. It wasn't about a boat. It was about a promise of a different kind of life, one measured in sunrises and nautical miles, not quarterly reports and hospital shifts. When they finally bought the Serenity, a well-maintained but older Beneteau Oceanis, it was the culmination of everything they had worked for. They spent a full year refitting it, their weekends consumed by sanding, varnishing, and installing new electronics. Alex's father, a retired mechanic, would drive down from Wisconsin to help, grumbling good-naturedly about the impracticality of it all, while secretly swelling with pride at his son's capability. Sarah's mother would pack them elaborate lunches, worried they weren't eating enough. Their families were their anchors, a tight-knit web of support. Sarah spoke to her younger sister Jessica almost every day. They were best friends, sharing every secret and every dream. The plan was for their parents and Jessica to fly down and meet them in various ports throughout their journey. This trip wasn't a departure from their family. It was an extension of it. Their core ambition was simple: to sail the Caribbean for a year. then crossed the Atlantic to the Mediterranean. It was a journey to reclaim their time, to be present with each other away from the demands of their careers. They wanted to read, to write, to learn a new language, to simply be. The life they had to live for was not just their own future, but a future filled with the people they loved. The stakes were immeasurably high because the life they were temporarily leaving was so rich, so full of connection and love. The interruption of that life would not just be a loss for them, but a cataclysm for everyone who knew them. Their last post on their travel blog, a picture of them smiling, sunburned with the green hills of St. Lucia behind them, was captioned, "Off to Martinique, fair winds and following seas. The adventure continues." It was a life bursting with promise, a vivid picture of happiness that, in a matter of hours, would be rendered a ghostly, tragic portrait of what was lost. The final hours of the Serenity were deceptively beautiful. On the morning of May 14, 2018, Alex and Sarah Jensen awoke to a perfect Caribbean dawn. The sea between St. Lucia and Martinique was a sheet of deep sapphire, ruffled by a gentle trade wind. The forecast was clear, predicting nothing but sunshine and calm seas for the 30 nautical mile crossing. It was a milk run, a simple day sail. After a breakfast of fresh mango and coffee in the cockpit, Alex meticulously went through his pre-departure checklist. He checked the engine, the rigging, the fuel levels. Sarah stowed loose items below deck and prepared a light lunch, humming along to a playlist they had made for the trip. Their mood was light, relaxed. This was the dream realized. The reward for a decade of disciplined saving and planning. They raised the mainsail just after 9 a.m., the white Dacron catching the morning sun with a satisfying snap. The boat heeled gently, picking up speed, leaving the lush green coastline of St. Lucia in its wake. Alex was at the helm, a picture of quiet competence, while Sarah lounged on the foredeck with a novel, occasionally calling out sightings of flying fish that skittered across the waves. Around noon, as they were midway across the channel, they noticed another vessel on the horizon. It was a fishing boat, a large, slightly rusted trawler-style vessel, not an uncommon sight in these waters. It appeared to be working a line and was keeping a steady distance. Alex noted it, logged its approximate position, and thought little more of it. An hour later, Sarah was preparing sandwiches below deck when a call came over the VHF radio. It was faint, crackled with static, and in a mixture of Spanish and heavily accented English. It wasn't a distress call, but it was unusual. It sounded like an argument, with one voice sharp and commanding, the other pleading. It lasted less than a minute before being abruptly cut off. Sarah called up to Alex. "Did you hear that?" He nodded, a slight furrow in his brow. "Strange," he said. "Probably just some radio interference or a crossed channel." They dismissed it, but a small, almost imperceptible seed of unease had been planted. The sky, which had been a flawless dome of blue, began to gather a few hazy, high-altitude clouds. This was the moment of the first, seemingly minor, but ultimately fatal decision. Their planned route would take them along the main shipping channel, a well-trafficked and safe passage to the southern coast of Martinique. However, Alex, ever the explorer, had been studying the charts. He pointed to a smaller, more secluded bay on the southwestern tip of the island, a place called Anse Noire, known for its black sand beach and excellent snorkeling. "We could divert here," he suggested. "It'll add a couple of hours to the trip, but the guidebook says it's unforgettable. We could have the whole anchorage to ourselves tonight. Be more of an adventure." Sarah, always game, readily agreed. The allure of a private paradise was too strong to resist. They altered their course, turning away from the safe, predictable route and heading toward the more isolated coastline. This deviation was a critical error. It took them out of the sight of casual traffic and into more remote waters. As they sailed on, they noticed the fishing trawler had also changed course, now mirroring their own path, still maintaining its distance. Alex pointed it out. "Guess they're heading for the same fishing grounds." It was a logical assumption, but it was wrong. The sun began to dip lower, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. They were approaching the headland that sheltered Anse Noire. The wind began to die down, as it often does near shore, forcing Alex to start the engine. The steady thrum of the diesel was a comforting sound. Sarah came up from the galley with 2 plates of pasta. They ate in the cockpit, watching the shoreline grow closer, talking about the snorkeling they would do in the morning. They were relaxed, happy, and completely unaware. The trawler was closer now, perhaps a mile off their stern. Its presence was no longer ignorable. It felt persistent. Alex grabbed his binoculars. He could see figures on its deck watching them. A chill, unrelated to the cooling evening air, prickled his skin. He turned to Sarah, his voice low. Something doesn't feel right. But before they could act, before they could turn back to the open sea or radio for help, it was too late. The trawler's engine roared to life, a deep guttural sound that tore through the evening calm. It closed the distance between them with terrifying speed. What happened next would remain a mystery for a full year. A silent, terrifying event that left behind only questions, an empty boat and a family's unending nightmare. The first sign that something was wrong came not with a bang, but with a deafening silence. On the evening of May 14th, Jessica, Sarah's younger sister, sat in her apartment in Boston, staring at her phone. The scheduled 8:00 p.m. satellite phone call from Alex and Sarah had come and gone. At 8:05, she sent a text. "Everything okay? Waiting for your call." No reply. At 8:15, she tried calling the sat phone directly. It went straight to a recorded message. A knot of anxiety began to tighten in her stomach. She told herself it was nothing. They were probably in a beautiful remote bay without a signal, just as they'd planned. They probably lost track of time. But Sarah was meticulous about check-ins. She knew how much Jessica and her parents worried. Forgetting wasn't like her. By 9 p.m., the knot of anxiety had grown into a cold stone of dread. Jessica called her parents. Her father, a calm and rational man, tried to soothe her. "They're fine, honey. They're experienced sailors. We'll hear from them in the morning." But Jessica could hear the forced placidity in his voice. She knew he was worried too. The night passed in a blur of sleeplessness and constant phone checking. By the next morning, May 15th, there was still no word. The silence was now screaming. Jessica, unable to wait any longer, made the call that officially set the wheels of fate in motion. She contacted the U.S. Coast Guard, her voice trembling as she explained the situation. The Coast Guard, in turn, coordinated with the MRCC, the French Maritime Rescue Coordination Center in Fort-de-France, Martinique. The initial response was measured. A missing check-in wasn't yet a full-blown emergency. They issued a pan-pan broadcast, an urgency signal requesting all vessels in the Martinique Channel to be on the lookout for the yacht Serenity. But as the hours ticked by with no sightings, the urgency escalated. By late afternoon, a French Navy helicopter was scrambled, its rotors beating a frantic rhythm against the humid air. It began flying a search pattern along the couple's presumed route. The searchers knew they were racing against time and the immense, unforgiving expanse of the Caribbean Sea. The discovery came on the morning of May 16th, nearly 36 hours after Alex and Sarah's last cheerful blog post. A French customs patrol boat, diverted to assist in the search, spotted it. A single white mast rocking gently on the swells about 10 miles southwest of Martinique. It was the Serenity. As the patrol boat drew closer, an eerie stillness became apparent. The sails were down and neatly furled. There was no visible damage to the hull or rigging. It was simply drifting. 2 officers boarded the yacht, their boots thudding ominously on the deserted deck. The scene they found was profoundly unsettling. The cockpit was tidy. A rope was coiled neatly. Below deck, the air was stale and silent. In the main cabin, 2 plates with the remains of a pasta dinner sat on the table, forks resting on them as if the diners had just stepped away for a moment. A novel lay face down on a settee, its page creased. On the navigation station, the ship's log was open. The last entry in Alex's precise handwriting was from 4:30 p.m. on the 14th. It noted their position and the decision to divert to Anse Noire. Everything appeared normal, yet it was terrifyingly wrong. The officers conducted a methodical search. The couple's wallets, passports, and cash were still in their cabin. Their laptops were on the table. Nothing of value seemed to be missing. There were no signs of a struggle, no overturned furniture, no blood. It was as if Alex and Sarah Jensen had simply evaporated. Then one of the officers made the most crucial observation. He went to the stern to check the emergency equipment. The EPIRB, the emergency position indicating radio beacon, was still in its cradle, unactivated. But the life raft canister was gone. The stainless steel bracket that held it was empty. This single out-of-place detail was the first concrete clue. It suggested they hadn't been washed overboard by a rogue wave. That would have been a sudden, chaotic event. The deployment of a life raft was a deliberate act. But why? Why would they abandon a perfectly sound vessel? And why, after deploying the raft, had they not activated the EPIRB, the one device designed to scream their location to satellites overhead? The scene was a paradox. It spoke of a calm, orderly departure from a perfectly good boat, followed by a complete and total disappearance. It was a contradiction that left the initial investigators baffled, staring out at the empty blue water with a growing sense of dread. The mystery had just begun. The discovery of the abandoned Serenity transformed a missing persons case into a full-scale international search and rescue operation. The initial theory, despite the eerie lack of evidence, was a tragic accident. Perhaps a sudden localized squall had hit them, or one of them had fallen overboard and the other had gone in after them. The missing life raft was the confounding variable, but authorities initially clung to the most plausible scenarios. The French Navy and Coast Guard immediately expanded the search grid, deploying multiple assets. A Falcon 50 surveillance jet, with its powerful radar and infrared cameras, began flying long, systematic transects over a vast swath of the Caribbean. Helicopters skimmed the waves, their crews scanning the endless blue for any sign of color. A life jacket, a piece of debris, the bright orange canopy of a life raft. Civilian vessels in the area were enlisted, their chatter over the radio a constant hum of hope and inquiry. The search area was immense, a moving, shifting target. Ocean currents in the region are complex and powerful, capable of carrying a small object like a life raft dozens of miles in a single day. The search coordinators used sophisticated drift models, inputting the Serenity's last known position, wind speeds, and current data to predict where the raft might be. It was a desperate, high-tech race against the clock. Alex and Sarah's families, frantic with worry, flew to Martinique immediately. They were met by a liaison officer from the French gendarmerie, a kind but overwhelmed man who tried to temper their expectations. They were sequestered in a hotel conference room that became their command center, its walls soon covered with maps and charts. The family's frustration quickly began to mount. They felt helpless, thousands of miles from home, separated from the search by a language barrier and a wall of official procedure. Alex's father, a practical man used to solving problems with his hands, paced the room like a caged animal. "Why aren't there more boats out there? Why aren't they flying at night?" he would demand, his voice raw with anguish. The liaison officer would patiently explain the limitations, the dangers of low-altitude night flights, the sheer scale of the ocean, the fact that a human head in the water is nearly invisible from the air. The search was being conducted by the book, methodically and professionally, but to a desperate family, by the book, felt agonizingly slow. Conflict arose not just from the family's desperation, but from external forces that seemed to conspire against the search. 3 days into the operation, a tropical storm, which had been a minor depression in the eastern Atlantic, rapidly intensified and veered west. The storm, named Beryl, brought torrential rains and gale-force winds to the search area. All air and sea assets had to be recalled to port for safety. For 48 critical hours, at the very moment when the couple's survival chances were dwindling most rapidly, the search was completely halted. The storm churned the ocean into a chaotic, muddy mess, likely erasing any debris trail and pushing the life raft, if it was still afloat, hundreds of miles off its predicted course. It was a stroke of meteorological cruelty. When the search resumed, the search area had expanded exponentially, becoming an almost impossible task. The family's hope began to crumble, replaced by a gnawing dread. Tragedy compounded the effort. On the 6th day of the search, a private helicopter, chartered by a wealthy friend of the Jensen family to supplement the official effort, suffered a mechanical failure. The pilot, a veteran American search and rescue specialist, managed to auto-rotate into the water, but the hard landing severely damaged the aircraft. While he and his spotter were rescued with minor injuries, the crash was a devastating blow to morale. It underscored the dangers of the operation and seemed like a grim omen. The official search methodology was sound, but it was failing. The vastness of the ocean was simply too great. Divers were sent down to inspect the area where the Serenity was found, but the seabed was hundreds of feet below, a dark, sandy plain that offered no clues. They searched the coastline of Martinique and nearby islands, but found nothing. After 10 days of exhaustive, fruitless effort, with the statistical probability of survival having dropped to near zero, the French authorities made the difficult decision to officially suspend the active search. The formal investigation remained open, but the planes went home. The boats returned to their regular patrols. For the Jensen and Miller families, the suspension was a devastating blow. It felt like the world was giving up. They were left with an empty yacht, a missing life raft, and a void of information so absolute, it was a form of torture. The failure of the search was complete, leaving the mystery of what happened to Alex and Sarah to be claimed by the silent, indifferent sea. The year that followed the suspension of the search was a long, slow descent into a state of limbo for the families of Alex and Sarah. The case of the vanished couple on the Serenity went cold, not with a sudden snap, but with a gradual, chilling fade. The initial media flurry subsided, replaced by the relentless cycle of new headlines. For the rest of the world, Alex and Sarah became a footnote, a cautionary tale for aspiring adventurers. But for their loved ones, their absence was a constant screaming presence in every room. Time, which is meant to heal, only served to deepen the wound, stretching the moment of their disappearance into an eternity of not knowing. Grief, without the closure of a body or an answer, cannot find a foothold. It remains a raw, open sore. Alex's father, Mark, refused to accept the official conclusion, or lack thereof. He channeled his grief into a frantic one-man investigation. He sold his beloved vintage car and poured the money into hiring a private investigator in the Caribbean, a grizzled ex-cop who spent 3 months chasing down rumors and interviewing dock workers, only to come up empty-handed. Mark built a website, findalexandsarah.com, a digital shrine filled with photos, maps, and desperate pleas for information. He spent his nights hunched over his computer, falling down rabbit holes of maritime crime forums and conspiracy theories about piracy, convinced there was a darker explanation. His obsession consumed him, creating a rift with his wife, who just wanted to find a way to mourn her son. Sarah's family dealt with the pain differently. Her mother retreated inward, a fragile silence descending over their once lively home. Her younger sister, Jessica, tried to be the strong one, managing the endless administrative nightmare of 2 people who had ceased to exist, but were not legally dead. She had to deal with banks, insurance companies, and employers, each conversation a fresh stab of pain. The Serenity, the vessel of their dreams, became a painful, million-dollar artifact. After being held by the French authorities for months, it was released to the families. Neither could bear to look at it, let alone set foot on it. It was a floating tomb, a monument to their lost hope. They sold it at a significant loss to a broker who quickly and discreetly resold it to a buyer in another country. They just wanted it gone. In the sailing community of the Caribbean, the story of the Serenity became a piece of modern folklore, a ghost story told over rum in shoreside bars. The official file remained open but inactive. The boat was found, but the people were gone. There was no crime scene, no motive, no suspects. It was a perfect mystery which made it all the more terrifying. The disappearance became a grim landmark in time and space. Other sailors crossing the Martinique Channel would grow quiet as they passed the coordinates where the yacht was found, a silent acknowledgement of the fragility of life on the open water. Some even began to refer to the yacht's last known position with a morbid nickname, Jensen's Deep, a place where the sea had simply swallowed 2 souls. The prevailing theory settled on a tragic, unexplainable accident, a rogue wave, a sudden medical emergency. It was the simplest explanation, and the one that allowed people to continue sailing these waters without succumbing to fear. But for the families, this explanation was a hollow comfort. It didn't account for the missing life raft or the unactivated beacon. It didn't account for the neatness of the boat, the half-eaten meal. The feeling of hopelessness became a permanent fixture in their lives. The ripple effects of that single, silent event on the water spread outward, touching everyone who loved them, leaving behind a legacy of unanswered questions and a profound, lingering ache that time refused to soothe. The mystery was no longer a case to be solved. It was a condition to be endured. For 1 full year, the mystery of the Serenity lay dormant, frozen in time like a ship in a bottle. The families endured the grim anniversary of the disappearance with quiet memorials. The pain as raw as it was on day one. The world had moved on. The case was, for all intents and purposes, dead. And then, in a place hundreds of miles away on an island with no direct connection to the initial search, a completely unrelated event acted as a catalyst, a twist of fate so improbable it felt like an intervention from the universe itself. The turn came on the wind-swept eastern coast of Barbados. It was a stretch of coastline known to locals as a collector of ocean debris, a place where the powerful Atlantic current spit out whatever they carried onto the rocky shores. On the afternoon of May 16, 2019, almost exactly 1 year to the day, the Serenity was discovered empty. A group of 4 local teenagers were on the beach, searching for sea glass and interesting driftwood. They were kicking through a tangle of sargassum weed and plastic bottles when one of them, a boy named Leo, saw something wedged between 2 black volcanic rocks. It was a splash of faded orange and gray fabric, nearly hidden. Curious, they tugged at it. It was heavy, waterlogged and partially buried in the sand. As they pulled, more of it was revealed. It was a deflated, battered life raft. Their initial reaction was mild curiosity. Flotsam was common here. But then another boy, Marcus, saw the lettering, faded and encrusted with salt, but still legible on a patch of the gray material. S.Y. Serenity. The name meant nothing to them. They were teenagers. Their world was school, surfing, and social media, not year-old maritime mysteries from another country. Still, it seemed important. It was clearly from a specific vessel. They almost left it there, but something made them look closer. Tucked inside a fold of the deflated raft was a length of rope, and tied to that rope was a small, white waterproof container, the kind used by kayakers to keep their valuables dry. It was a pelican case, scarred and abraded from its long journey, but its seal looked intact. Now their curiosity was piqued. A treasure chest? They managed to pry the case loose. It was surprisingly heavy. They tried to open it, but the latches were stiff with salt and corrosion. Realizing this was something more than just beach junk, Leo, whose uncle was a local policeman, made a call. An hour later, a weathered police Land Rover bumped its way down the sandy track to the beach. The officer, a veteran of the Barbados police force, immediately recognized the potential significance. He knew the stories that circulated among island nations. He remembered the headlines from the year before. The Serenity. He carefully took possession of the raft, and more importantly, the sealed container. The discovery sent a jolt through the quiet police station in the nearby parish. The local authorities contacted their counterparts in Martinique and, through them, Interpol. Within hours, the news had crossed the Atlantic and reached the families. The phone call to Jessica Miller, Sarah's sister, was a lightning bolt to the heart. A life raft, a sealed container. After a year of absolute nothing, it was an impossible, terrifying surge of hope and dread. Hope, because it was the first new piece of evidence since the disappearance. Dread, because of what it might contain. What could survive a year adrift in the ocean? What final, terrible message might be waiting inside that box? The significance of the lead was immense. This wasn't a theory or a rumor. It was a tangible object, a direct link to the last moments of Alex and Sarah. It had traveled an impossible distance, guided by nothing but wind and current, to land on this specific beach, to be found by these specific teenagers. It was the key. The entire narrative, which had ended in a frustrating question mark, was about to be reopened. The cold, dead case was suddenly, violently alive again. All eyes turned to that small, white, scarred box. The discovery of the Pelican case on the shores of Barbados triggered a flurry of activity that felt like a defibrillator shock to the heart of the cold case. The families, propelled by a terrifying mixture of hope and fear, immediately arranged to fly to the island. Jessica, Sarah's sister, was chosen as the family representative, her presence legally required for the official opening of the container. She was met at the airport by a solemn detective from the Barbados police force and a newly assigned liaison from the U.S. Embassy. The atmosphere was thick with a tension that had been building for a full year. The case was opened in a sterile, fluorescent-lit evidence room at the police headquarters. The moment was recorded on video. A forensics officer, wearing blue latex gloves, carefully cleaned the salt and sand from the container's latches. With a series of loud, stiff clicks, he opened the seals. The air in the room seemed to hold its breath. He lifted the lid. Inside, perfectly preserved, were two items. The first was a small, personal GPS tracker, the kind hikers and sailors use to log their routes. The second was a standard spiral-bound notebook, its pages filled with neat, steady handwriting. It was a journal. Jessica let out a small, choked sob. She recognized it immediately. It was Sarah's handwriting. The detective gently slid the notebook across the table. For the next 2 hours, Jessica read her sister's final words aloud, her voice breaking as she narrated the story the ocean had kept secret. The journal began on the evening of May 14, 2018. It described in harrowing detail the fishing trawler that had turned into a predator. It wasn't a pirate ship in the traditional sense. They weren't after the boat. They were smugglers. The men who boarded the Serenity were hard, silent, and professional. They were led by a cold-eyed man with a Slavic accent. Alex, in a desperate act of defiance, had tried to trigger a hidden distress signal at the navigation station. He was caught. The leader struck him viciously with a heavy wrench. The journal described the sickening sound, and Alex crumpling to the deck, gravely injured with a fractured skull. The men weren't interested in violence for its own sake. They were brutally efficient. They were transferring a shipment of something. Sarah thought illegal weapons, from their trawler to a hidden compartment on the Serenity. Their plan was to use the innocent-looking private yacht to ferry the contraband into Martinique, bypassing customs. Alex and Sarah were simply witnesses who had been in the wrong place at the wrong time. After transferring their cargo, the smugglers made their cold-blooded decision. They couldn't leave witnesses, but murdering them outright and scuttling the yacht would create a more aggressive investigation. Instead, they opted for a more passive form of execution. They deployed the Serenity's life raft, put the barely conscious Alex and a terrified Sarah into it, with a single gallon of water and no food, and set them adrift. They disabled the yacht's engine and set it on a slow drift in the opposite direction, creating a scene that would suggest an accident or a mysterious disappearance, confusing any search efforts. The smugglers believed the sea would do their dirty work for them. Sarah's journal then became a chronicle of a slow-motion nightmare. It detailed the first few days adrift, the brutal, relentless sun, the agonizing thirst. She wrote of trying to care for Alex, whose condition was deteriorating rapidly. He was delirious, his breathing shallow. She wrote of her love for him, of their shared dreams filling the pages with memories as if to keep the hope alive. The entries grew shorter, the handwriting weaker. She described Alex passing away peacefully on the 4th day, holding her hand. She had stayed with his body for a full day, unable to let him go before finally committing him to the sea in a tear-choked prayer. While Jessica read, the forensics team was working on the GPS tracker. They extracted its data and projected it onto a large screen in the room. The map showed the life raft's journey. It was a chaotic, meandering path pushed by the shifting currents, a 2-week-long odyssey of survival and despair. It showed them drifting far south of the original search grid, explaining why the planes and boats had never seen them. Then came the final, shocking revelation. The journal's last entry, dated May 29th, 2 weeks after they were set adrift, was almost illegible, the writing of a person at the absolute limit of human endurance. Sarah wrote that she had seen a ship, a massive cargo tanker. It was on the horizon, but it was real. She used their last ounce of strength to fire the single emergency flare they had. The journal described her elation as the tanker changed course and headed directly for them. It got closer and closer, a mountain of steel promising salvation. She could see men on the bridge watching her through binoculars. She waved, she screamed, she cried with relief. And then, for no reason she could understand, the tanker slowed, stopped, and then slowly turned away, resuming its original course and leaving her to die. Her last written words were, they saw me, and they left. Why? The GPS tracker corroborated her story. Its final data points, logged just before its battery died, placed the life raft directly on a major international shipping lane between South America and Europe. And it recorded a period of several hours where it was stationary, right next to where a large vessel would have been. The investigation now had a new explosive direction. This wasn't just a story of smugglers and a tragic death at sea. It was a story of a second deliberate act of inhumanity. The new objective was clear and urgent. Find that ship. Using the GPS coordinates, the date from the journal, and satellite-based maritime traffic data, a team of analysts began to sift through the records of every commercial vessel that passed through that specific patch of ocean on May 29, 2018. After 48 hours of intense work, they found a match. A 50,000-ton bulk cargo carrier, the Orion Cargo, registered in Panama and operated by a notoriously shady Liberian-based freight company, had passed through those exact coordinates at that exact time. Its log showed an undocumented and unexplained course deviation lasting 2 hours, precisely matching the timeline from Sarah's journal and the GPS data. They had found their ghost ship. The climax of the investigation was just beginning. The hunt was on, not just for the smugglers on the trawler, but for the captain and crew of the Orion Cargo, the men who had looked a dying woman in the eye and chosen to sail away. The identification of the Orion Cargo shifted the investigation into a global manhunt. The case was no longer a mystery about a disappearance, but a complex criminal inquiry spanning multiple jurisdictions. Interpol issued a global notice for the vessel and its crew. The first break came when investigators tracked down the ship's ownership, a web of shell corporations designed to obscure liability. The company, a low-cost operator with a history of safety violations, eventually provided a crew manifest for the Orion Cargo's voyage in May 2018. The crew was a mix of nationalities, and most had since scattered to other ships and other companies. The primary targets were the captain, a 58-year-old Russian national named Viktor Orlov, and his Ukrainian first mate. Working with national police forces, investigators began tracking down the lower-ranking crew members one by one. Many were uncooperative, fearing both legal repercussions and retaliation from their former captain. The breakthrough came from a Filipino deckhand named Rico, who was located working on a different vessel docked in Singapore. Placed under immense pressure by local authorities and an agent from the FBI's legal attaché office, and offered a deal for his testimony, Rico finally broke his silence. His confession laid out the entire sordid story of that day. He confirmed that they had seen the flare and the life raft. He was on the bridge and saw the woman through binoculars. He said the entire bridge crew saw her. Captain Orlov, a man he described as a tyrant with a vicious temper, had ordered the ship to alter course to investigate. As they drew closer, it was clear it was a lone survivor in a state of extreme distress. Rico said there was a moment of debate on the bridge. The first mate urged the captain to follow maritime law and render aid. But Captain Orlov had a secret worth more than a human life. The Orion Cargo was carrying legitimate cargo, bulk grain. But hidden within that cargo, in specially modified containers, was a multi-million-dollar shipment of refined cobalt, illegally mined in the Congo, and being smuggled to a black market buyer in Europe. Rescuing Sarah Jensen would have meant bringing her aboard. It would have meant notifying the Coast Guard of the rescue. It would have meant the authorities would eventually board his ship. The risk of an inspection, however routine, was too high. Any official presence on his vessel could expose his criminal enterprise. So, Viktor Orlov made a calculated, purely economic decision. He weighed the value of Sarah's life against the value of his illegal cargo and the risk of a long prison sentence. The math was simple and brutal. He ordered the ship to turn away. Rico described the chilling silence on the bridge as the crew, cowed into submission, watched the life raft and the lone woman shrink in the ship's wake. The captain logged the course deviation as an engine check to avoid arousing suspicion. The why was now sickeningly clear. It was pure, unadulterated greed. The life of a woman was an acceptable loss to protect a criminal conspiracy. While the hunt for Orlov continued, a separate investigation focused on the smugglers. Sarah's journal provided a crucial description of the lead smuggler and the trawler. Using this description, French authorities cross-referenced it with their own intelligence on smuggling operations in the Lesser Antilles. The description of the cold-eyed Slavic man matched a known operative in a regional arms trafficking ring, a former Serbian paramilitary soldier named Dragan Kovic. He was known to use converted fishing trawlers for his work. Based on this intelligence, French commandos staged a raid on a suspected smuggling safe house on the island of Guadeloupe. They didn't find Kovic, but they found evidence linking him to the Serenity case, including charts of the Martinique Channel with Alex and Sarah's yacht circled. Arrests followed. The first to fall was the first mate of the Orion cargo, who was apprehended in a port in Germany. He quickly confessed, corroborating Rico's story in an attempt to save himself. His testimony painted Orlov as the sole decision-maker, a ruthless man who ruled by fear. The net was closing. 6 months after the life raft was found, Victor Orlov was finally captured. Acting on a tip, Spanish police arrested him as he tried to board a flight to a non-extradition country from the airport in Barcelona. He was no longer the imposing captain. He was a haggard, desperate man. He denied everything. Dragan Kovic, the smuggler, proved more elusive. He disappeared, likely using his network to create a new identity. He remains a fugitive to this day. The immediate aftermath of the revelations was a whirlwind of legal proceedings. The remains of Alex and Sarah were never recovered from the sea, but Sarah's journal served as her final testimony. Victor Orlov and his first mate were extradited to the United States to face charges, as the victims were American citizens. The world now understood not only what had happened to Alex and Sarah, but why. It wasn't a tragic accident or a random act of piracy. It was a chain of events forged by human evil, the brutal pragmatism of a smuggler, and the cold economic calculation of a cargo captain. The resolution of the mystery brought no joy, only a profound and heavy sorrow. For the Jensen and Miller families, learning the truth was like being submerged in ice. The ambiguity that had tortured them for a year was gone, but it was replaced by a reality more horrific than anything they could have imagined. They were forced to process two distinct tragedies: the violent attack by the smugglers and the cold-blooded abandonment by the crew of the Orion cargo. The journal, that small, miraculous survivor, was both a gift and a curse. It gave them Sarah's voice back, but it forced them to live through her final, agonizing days. Jessica described the experience of reading it as walking barefoot on shattered glass. Every word was a testament to her sister's love and strength, but also a fresh wound. They learned of Alex's bravery, his attempt to fight back, and of Sarah's incredible resilience in caring for him. They learned that even in the face of death, her thoughts were of her family, with messages to her parents and to Jessica filling the final pages. It was a brutal, intimate form of closure. The trial of Victor Orlov became a focal point for their grief and anger. The families attended every day, sitting in the front row of the courtroom, their faces a stony mask of pain. They listened to the testimony of the crewmen, to the maritime experts who explained the laws of the sea, the sacred, ancient duty to render aid. The defense argued that Orlov had believed it was a trap set by pirates, a common fear among captains in some waters. But the prosecution, using Sarah's journal as the centerpiece of their case, painted a damning picture of his motives. They presented evidence of his smuggling operation, proving that his decision was not driven by fear, but by greed. Sarah's final words, "They saw me and they left. Why?" were read to the jury, her voice echoing through the silent courtroom. In the end, Victor Orlov was found guilty of, among other charges, involuntary manslaughter, his inaction directly leading to Sarah's death. He was sentenced to the maximum term, a cold comfort for the families, but a vital acknowledgement of his crime. The first mate received a lesser sentence in exchange for his testimony. With the legal battles over, the families could finally, truly mourn. They held a joint memorial service on a cliff overlooking the Pacific Ocean. It wasn't the Caribbean, but it was the sea, the entity that had held their children for so long. They didn't read the harrowing parts of the journal. Instead, they read the passages where Sarah wrote of her love for Alex, their dreams, and her memories of family. They brought the story back to a personal, human level. They celebrated the lives Alex and Sarah had lived, not just the tragedy of how they ended. There was a sense of profound connection between the two families, forged in shared loss. In the aftermath, they found a small measure of peace, not in forgiveness, but in understanding. They knew their children had faced the worst of humanity, but they had faced it together, and their love had been the last thing to endure. The relief of knowing the truth was inextricably mixed with the pain of that truth. The years had not been wasted in a search for a ghost. They had been lost to the deliberate, cruel actions of men. The void Alex and Sarah left would never be filled, but the questions that had haunted the edges of that void had finally been answered. The story of Alex and Sarah Jensen and the Orion cargo resonated far beyond the courtroom. It became a global case study in maritime ethics and the dark pockets of lawlessness that still exist on the high seas. The trial exposed a chilling reality, that the ancient unwritten law of the sea, the duty to rescue those in peril, could be casually discarded for profit. The case moved from the pages of true crime to the agendas of international maritime organizations. Advocacy groups, spearheaded by the Jensen and Miller families, began a powerful campaign for legislative change. They argued that the fear of regulatory scrutiny or legal complications, however unfounded, could create a perverse incentive for ship captains to ignore distress calls. Their efforts gained traction. In response to the public outcry, several maritime nations began to reevaluate their policies. The movement culminated in the proposal of a new international maritime accord, unofficially dubbed Sarah's Law. The core tenet of the proposed law was to provide a safe harbor provision for captains who render aid in good faith. It would protect them from undue delays, inspections, and legal liabilities that were not directly related to the rescue itself, thereby removing the very excuse Viktor Orlov's defense team had tried to use. The legacy of Alex and Sarah became one of reform. Their personal tragedy was transformed into a catalyst for a systemic change designed to save future lives. The story was a powerful reflection on the duality of human nature. It showcased the depth of evil, the casual cruelty of the smuggler Dragan Kovic, and the calculated inhumanity of Captain Orlov. But it also, and more importantly, highlighted the incredible power of love and human compassion. Sarah's determination to chronicle her final days, to care for Alex, and to leave a record for her family was an act of profound love. The actions of the teenage boys who reported their discovery, the diligent police work across multiple countries, and the bravery of the crewmen who testified, all spoke to a collective human impulse toward justice and truth. The story serves as a universal lesson. In the vast, indifferent emptiness of the ocean, the most powerful forces are not the wind or the waves, but the choices made in the human heart. A dream of freedom on the open water became a story of survival, not against the elements, but against the cold indifference of men. One couple's final desperate message, sealed in a plastic box and carried by the currents, was a testament to their love and a final damning piece of evidence that brought a dark, international conspiracy to light. If this story of tragedy and the unyielding fight for truth resonated with you, please show your support by liking this video, sharing it with others, and subscribing for more true crime mysteries that deserve to be told. The actions of Captain Orlov raise a profound question about justice on the high seas. Tell us in the comments what you believe is the appropriate penalty for a captain who makes the deliberate choice to leave someone to die at sea.